One, thank you for joining us for using the EQI 2.0 or 2.0 for executive development, research, and pre-employment. Sponsored by MHS Assessments and presented by John Hughes. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you that this webcast has been pre-approved for HRCI credit and can also be used for SHRM credit. Please be sure to attend the complete webcast in order to receive your credits. After the webcast, you'll receive an email from HR.com within 1 to 2 business days. It will include your certification credit information. You can also log into HR.com and go to your View My Credits page where you can see the credits that you have received. If you have any questions today for our presenter or for HR.com, please type them into your questions tab on your GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll be sure to follow up with you. And it's my pleasure now to turn you over to John Hughes.
Thank you, Sylvie. Appreciate it. And hi, everyone. I want to first admit that this is my first webinar. So from that perspective, there's a lot to talk about in a very short period of time because I've been using the EQI for a very long period of time. But before getting started, I want to first thank Sylvie from HR.com as well as Chris Aarons from MHS for suggesting and giving me the webinar opportunity. So from the first slide, I started using the EQI 2.0, EQI in general, for executive development, kind of stumbled into the research area and found a big connection to pre-employment. So what I've noticed with webinars is there's no one way of introducing yourself. So to give you some background on my own history, go back to 1979, which is the year I was married, and also started as a director of residence at Iona College. And at the same time, I was working to complete my graduate degree in counseling. So anyone who's lived in a dormitory knows it's almost an immaturing experience in many ways because it's living life to its fullest. Also, back in 1979, it was the year after Animal House had come out, and the drinking age in New York was still 18, so it was a very interesting environment to complete my graduate work, as well as work with real-life situations in dormitories. Anyone who's been in the dormitory setting, you know the social side of it. But again, it was an opportunity for me to start to hone my counseling skills. It was from Iona College that I made connections to IBM and was able to move over there in 1985. My very first job in IBM was stockholder relations. It was kind of a staff position. So I was able to go from my graduate work environment into a staff environment to kind of see, kind of at the bottom line, bottom level, if you will, how organizations operate. Stockholder relations was interesting because it gave me the administrative side of the organization. But within a year, I realized that when you're in a large organization, you're going to have to make things happen yourself. You're going to have to find ways of moving. And it was in stockholder relations I met a gentleman by the name of Willie Ng, and Willie had moved into international assignments about 10 months after we started. So then I realized I want to move into international assignments as well. Willie had been on assignment to Beijing, came back from Beijing, and was invited to a welcome home party at someone's house. So I was invited to the party as well and asked to do one thing, which was to bring dessert. So I went to a local Chinese restaurant, got the symbol for good luck and good fortune, brought it to a Jewish bakery, had them put it on a sheet cake, and delivered it to the party. Now, Willie was so ecstatic over this, we reconnected, and about 3 or 4 months later, he invited me to join international assignments in IBM. So this is my quick little story on how you make things happen in your own life, in your own career, and it's about relationships. And not knowing it at the time, it was about emotional intelligence and how you use those relationships to kind of help move your career forward. International assignments, fascinating experience because it was the first time I got a chance to actually work with executives who were away from home using email and communicating that way. So it gave me really insight into the executive world, the executive mind. It also gave me an opportunity to visit Tokyo, visit Japan, and actually visit with international assignments for 2 weeks. The good part of that is I got a great experience, and also a good part of that, I wasn't terminated, which is a whole nother story. But again, just like in IBM, you need to make things happen on your own. When the stock dropped to a particular level, I was able to get a job as a staff trainer with the New York Times. And the New York Times at the time, between the early 90s, late 90s, went through a tremendous period of growth. It was a time where the New York Times had moved to color. I was happened to have the opportunity to work with the advertising department, and I was on the business side versus the editorial side, but it was an opportunity to see processes, work with executives, see how things come together. Back then, the New York Times weighed about the Sunday Times weighed about 6 pounds. So production was a key area, circulation. So again, it gave me insight into a lot of different processes within the newspaper world. And it was their opportunity to meet Dan Goleman. In 1995, the advertising sales department had a sales conference and invited Dan to speak. And it was the year he had written Emotional Intelligence. And to me, there was something about emotional intelligence that really connected with me on a personal level as well as a professional level. Because at that time, I was looking at different assessments, the Myers-Briggs, the DISC. There was something about the whole topic of emotional intelligence that seemed to frame these skills differently. And to me, it was very attractive. So it was the next year, 1997, that I was certified in the EQI. So looking back, it's 20 years of working with the instrument. And working with this kind of instrument internally is kind of tricky because what I did initially was I offered emotional intelligence classes at the times, offered people to take the EQI afterwards and sit down and debrief them. And EQI is kind of a complicated instrument. So this is my ability to first cut my teeth on the instrument in a real work environment. From there, Dan Goleman came out with his working with emotional intelligence the following year, and I kept getting certified. First in the ECI, which was based on Dan Goleman's competency model, and then the Mesquite. The Mesquite stands for the Mayer Salve Caruso Emotional Intelligence Test. So I wanted to learn as much about the topic as I could because I was convinced that there was a lot of value in the type of data that it offered. 2007 was a big year because it was my opportunity to leave the New York Times. Either I could stay and see what it was going through with the loss of revenue and everything that started to move to the web, or I can cut out and go start on my own, which I did, starting my own business. But I still had to learn more. There was a lot that I still wanted to learn about emotional intelligence. So I continued actually reading books I'd read before, but in a different context when you're out there all alone. So I know some people on this call, you're internal and you'd like to go external someday, and I just want to let you know it is possible. It's all about kind of preparing yourself, which I started doing through the 90s. So when there was an opportunity to move on and start my own business, I was able to do it. And I've made the cornerstone of my business emotional intelligence, and specifically the EQI. So from there, again, I continued reading as much as I could about the topic and how to apply different areas, and establish EI assessments. It's almost 10 years up in operation. Now, emotional intelligence, it's multidimensional, if you will. I know I start with executive coaching because, again, that's primarily where I work with my customers. But I also find out when I'm working with an executive coach, most of the time they want me to work with their team because the value that's presented in the EQI, it helps not only on an individual basis, but also on a team basis. With that, also leadership development. I've had a couple opportunities to work in companies with team development initiatives, and it presents the kind of data that I haven't seen any other tool actually present. Career transitions, some work that I've seen, some work is connected to a person's particular skills. Maybe not happy in their current job, they're looking for another opportunity. The EQI sometimes helps them point them in a direction because it lets them know where their strengths are and what they should be pursuing. Pre-employment is the focus pretty much of this call. And again, it wasn't something I originally set out to do when I started working with EQI, but the uses and the applications of it seem to keep growing. Again, I haven't included research there. So looking at pre-employment, a couple of questions that I thought would be useful. What are the connections between emotional intelligence, leadership, and acquiring the right talent for a job? So the focus there is on leadership. Every company I've worked for is looking to develop leadership, either at the staff level, at the executive level. Leadership is what drives organizations. Leadership, it's what every company wants. So what are ways of identifying emotional intelligence strengths associated with different job groups? This is what I eventually, in fact, when I say stumbled into because it wasn't my original intent, but once you start to gather all this data information, it started to have a certain amount of application. And application was, what are other uses for this data in terms of, from the EQI? What else can I perhaps use it with? So start with that first question, the connections to leadership. Some of you may have read the article Ace the Assessment, written back in 2015, because this to me is kind of it's a big, I guess, justification, if you will, or explanation for why organizations use pre-employment tools. So the research shows that 70% of organizations with more than 100 employees rely on assessment tools. Again, those areas of job competence, work ethics, and emotional intelligence. So if you were to Google leadership models right now, again, the focus is on leadership, you come up with about 166 million entries. So there's something about adding to this whole design which I found kind of inviting, because after working with the EQI for over 20 years, I started to see some certain trends in the data, certain information which I found would be very useful. So here is my leadership model, if you will, and it starts with the IQ, right? When we went to school, when we were young, reading and writing and math, it was all that was important to us. And when you think about the jobs that you're doing right now, a lot of people are in jobs because they know how to solve the problem related to the job. They have information. They have the ability to recall, use, and synthesize data. They know how to use information relevant to their jobs. With that information, they know how to communicate, how to sell, how to use it within their organization. Understanding mathematical concepts. This is all about finance. This is all about knowing how to do things from a financial perspective. Different numeric symbols. We all have our own symbols and logos, if you will. Reading, writing, and comprehension. This is all what we're doing every day. So if you look at each one of these skills, if you step back, I would imagine that your job is in here somewhere. Right? We're constantly doing things, whether it's writing, processing, accumulating, analyzing, knowing. It's that job knowledge piece. And it's what we measure by the IQ. And it's interesting because every once in a while I will ask executives, do you have any idea what your IQ is? And to me, it's interesting how many people actually know. I've read an article recently that said if your IQ is over 115, more than likely you can learn almost any job that's out there, because your IQ isn't going to hold you back from anything. If your IQ is 100, like mine's around 100, 105 in that category, you're going to struggle at times. So for me, going to school was always a bit of a challenge. If I struggled, or if I pushed myself as hard as I could, I can come away with a B. So in my world, the IQ was always, it was required, it's needed, but wasn't something that always came natural to me. On the other side, we have the EQ. So unlike the IQ, which is measured on our x-axis, we have the y-axis, the x-axis of the EQ. So EQ is what we're talking about in terms of people with a high level of emotional intelligence. They know what they're doing in terms of setting goals for themselves. In fact, people with high emotional intelligence, I notice, they have their resumes. You can go back over their resumes. They can identify the goals, the teaching, the certifications, the learnings, the things they did to get to where they are, and the things they're going to do to get forward. So there's something about goals with emotional intelligence it's a very strong connection. They have an understanding of their abilities, of what they could do and what they're good at, what they're not good at. They have an awareness of not only their emotions, of how they feel, but also their influence on other people, which is extremely important when you're in an executive position. They know how to communicate their positions in a non-offensive way. In other words, they know how to disagree with people without making you feel belittled or small. They know how to be able to articulate, to be able to communicate their feelings, their disappointments even, in a way that you're able to hear. They can maintain positive outlooks in the face of adversity. No matter what happens, they're able to kind of rebound themselves, if you will. They're effective at managing not only their own feelings, but other feelings of people as well. People with high emotional intelligence, they know the power of consensus and of groups. They know how to work not only with themselves, but they know how to work with a community, with building consensus. They know how to collaborate and cooperate with people. And also, people with high emotional intelligence tend to have very strong active listening skills, because that's where they're able to establish trust. That's where they're able to connect with other people. Now, the EQ is measured by, in terms of these two axes, the X and the Y axis, the EQ is measured by, or the people skills here, is measured by the EQI. So this might be the first time you've seen it, and you can get this off the internet. This is basically page 3 from the Jane Doe copy of the EQI 2.0. And I just want to take you through the skills, because by going through the skills, you'd really appreciate what are some of the strengths or some of the conversations that you have with people who take it. So I'd say overall, Jane has a pretty strong EQ, by the way. She's just come up very strong. But starting with the first one, self-regard. Self-regard often indicates to me the client's level of confidence in what they're currently doing. And many times, self-regard reflects the client's inner voice. What do they say to themselves? What does he or she say to themselves when they're up against a challenge? And Jane seems pretty good, but I have seen the score go low, in which case some people can have confidence problems, which come across. Self-actualization, I often describe this as a person's goal line. In other words, self-actualization is going to indicate to me, is the person in a job, are they in a situation, are they in a profession that they really enjoy and that they're growing? Do they feel like they're contributing to it? And if you notice, Jane's on the high end here. She's about 119. So Jane is the type of person that, yeah, if I probably ask her about her resume, she probably has a series of goals, and at this strength, she probably has another goal that she wants to go after. So this first area of self-perception, that starts to give me an indication of how does the client see his or her world. There's also find a connection between self-actualization and self-regard. If a person's self-regard's too high, they can come off as arrogant or complacent, which you have to be careful of. Self-actualization, again, it's that drive towards goals, which is important. Self-expression, emotional expression, is a person's ability to communicate their feelings, their comfort level expressing a wide range of emotions. In this situation, Jane seems very comfortable with her emotions. She seems very comfortable probably saying, expressing to people when she's angry, when she's upset. People who fall below the 100 line here, with like 80 or 85, they could be poker players sometimes. In other words, they may know how they feel, but they're not going to let other people know. If you notice, let's say that Jane Doe's her self-awareness is 115, but let's say that her expression was 90. She knows how she feels, but she may not let you know how she feels. So, and these start to come out, in which case that prompts a conversation about relationships. Also see Jane's coming in at 112 in assertiveness. Assertiveness is a person's external voice. What do they say? How do they show up? Usually I see this as a leadership line. And Jane's pretty comfortable giving directions, and probably Jane's very clear when she gives directions. Because I usually look for a connection between assertiveness and self-regard. What's the connection there? Does a person have an internal voice, and what's their external voice? Because sometimes I'll meet executives and they have a low level of assertiveness. They could be the smartest person in the room, but it tells me they're not speaking up unless conditions are perfect. Then we have independence, and independence is a person's ability to make an independent decision. It's their ability to listen to other people, share their problems, share their issues with people, but at the end of the day, own the decision that they make. And Jane looks like a pretty confident decision maker. That's also in line with her self-confidence. So this would tell me she's strong in that category. Interpersonal relationships, that's Jane's ability to connect with people. It's her ability to listen. It's her ability to know when relationships need a little bit more attention. It's her ability to know when she needs to take someone out to lunch, to reconnect with someone. And this would tell me that she's probably very good at establishing relationships and has that level of sensitivity. So you can see, each one of these skills has its own relevance, its own connection, but it's also connected with some of these other skills. Empathy is a very strong level for Jane as well. And empathy is a person's, just as I said before, in terms of listening, empathy is the key listening skill. If a person wants to develop their empathy, invariably it's about encouraging to try active listening techniques. Because empathy is the ability to connect with a person. Yes, it's ability to read body language, but it's even more. When I see high levels of empathy, it indicates to me not only can a person work with someone in the moment, but high levels of empathy can actually tell me that a person can anticipate emotional needs. In this case, kind of feeds into her interpersonal relationships as well as her social responsibility. Because this would indicate to me that Jane's a pretty strong team player. Social responsibility is about being aware of the people around you and their strengths and their needs and your ability to help them and work with them. Social responsibility is the ability of people to build consensus, to be collaborative in many environments. What I've noticed with a lot of the executives I work with, they tend to score pretty high in independence because they're very good at making independent decisions. They're not as high, they don't score as high in social responsibility. So a lot of times executives will be hired into organizations, expecting themselves to make independent decisions, finding out later that in fact, no, you're now part of a team and you now have to build consensus. So this could be a bit of a challenge for some clients making that transition. Problem solving. Problem solving is interesting to fall under the umbrella of emotional intelligence, because every problem that we solve has an emotional component to it. So at the very least, emotionally, you want to make a good decision to feel good. Sometimes we have to make decisions because we're afraid that someone else is going to make them, or we're annoyed that we have to make them, they fall on our lap. But our decisions are laced with emotions when we step back and look at them. This would tell me that Jane has a methodology for managing those emotions. In other words, Jane has a methodology for identifying, assessing, analyzing, and solving problems. She's very good at that. She also will take into account emotional data when she makes decisions. Sometimes I'll come across executives that are very good at problem solving, but tend to be very low in empathy or low in interpersonal relationships, which they may have the cognitive solution to a problem, but they don't have the emotional connection to it, which again is going to create a bit of a gap. Problem solving is very strong. If I had to caution Jane on anything, her problem solving skills are higher than her empathy. And what that tells me that in problem solving mode, Jane may not be as good a listener as she usually is. In fact, I'm sure there are many people on this phone call whose spouse or partner or better half has said to them, don't solve my problem, just listen to me. That tells me that you're in problem solving mode as opposed to listening mode. So that's the one caution I take out of this profile so far. So again, very strong problem solving. Jane also has a very good at reality testing. Reality testing is Jane's not going to accept reality as it is. She's going to ask questions. She's going to drill down. Jane's the kind of person who's not going to be afraid, based on her assertiveness, to put her voice out there to try to understand something at a higher level. She's going to challenge people, but she wants to find out what the information is. Impulse control tells me that Jane's not an impulsive person. She's the kind of person to use her methodology, gather information, and come up with a plan before she executes anything. Jane probably has a pretty good sense of humor, probably doesn't get angry quickly, because people who fall down to a lower level, they can create some concern in terms of their ability to respond and react too quickly. Jane scores very high in flexibility. And flexibility is the ability to, at the end of the day, manage change. This score always tells me, is the client, what's the tolerance level for a changing environment? Some environments, again, working at the Times, high level of flexibility was required. Not everyone could adapt to that type of environment. Some people fall within the 100, 105 range. Give me a little bit of change, but not a lot. Jane falls in at 112, which is a good level of a good, strong ability to manage change. I meet some entrepreneurs that are up at 125, 130 in terms of flexibility. It's a great skill to have, but it can drive people crazy unless there's someone else in the organization that's able to balance that flexibility and take that energy and focus it in the right direction. This is I find that's a lot in startup organizations. Again, high flexibility, but again, you need someone to know how to push in the right direction. Stress tolerance. Jane has a good level of stress tolerance. In fact, looking at Jane's stress tolerance with her emotional self-awareness, I wouldn't be surprised if Jane does yoga or something like that in order to manage the stress of her job. And finally, optimism. I would say that she's optimistic. She has a way of, also the optimism is in line with her emotional self-awareness, but Jane probably has a way of positioning even bad things as a learning point. It will find ways of moving forward regardless of what might be ahead of her. So this is something that, again, it would be important to in terms of optimism, in terms of how Jane shows up. So stepping back, this is the EQI. This is what I find is an incredibly valuable tool, and one I've been working with for, again, externally for the last 10 years, overall for the last 20 years. So our mission has been to help individuals and organizations maximize their emotional intelligence capabilities. And you can see here, these are the organizations, in fact, not all of them, most of them I've had an opportunity to work with over the last 10 years. And so most of them, or a lot of them are one-on-one. Sometimes I'll do groups. Arrow Electronics I initially worked with for a women's leadership program. You'll see here my opportunity to work with several Major League Baseball teams. Before I left the New York Times, I had an opportunity to work and meet with Wendy Lewis. Wendy Lewis, who did work as the Senior Vice President of Diversity, Senior Vice President of Diversity and Strategic Partnerships for Major League Baseball. So Wendy and I connected before I left the Times, and she thought that emotional intelligence had a lot of relevance to the diversity and inclusion space. So we're able to work with these different ball clubs around the topic of emotional intelligence, inclusion, and leadership. So I had an opportunity to visit these organizations. Also worked with several nonprofit organizations, currently working in Comcast. Also had an opportunity to work with the D&I team from the Air Force, and had an opportunity to visit the Pentagon, giving them back their EQI results. Earlier this year, I had an opportunity to work with ADP's Multicultural Leadership Development Program, which they launched as a way of kind of building emotional intelligence skills into the leadership ranks. And also work with Customers Bank. Customers Bank, I worked with for the last 3 years, $10 billion company. Everyone coming into that organization has an EQI as a way of kind of encouraging it, embedding it into the culture. So, stepping back, we now have the X and Y axis. We can measure IQ. Again, a lot of people know their IQ. And we can now measure EQ. So from my perspective, what I thought I found here was the leadership line. What is that balance between EQ and IQ that people need to develop to be better leaders? So introducing to use IQ, EQ leadership grid. So again, the IQ is based on increments of 15 on the y-axis, and the x-axis we have what would be a person's EQI results. Now, to validate this, what I did was I spent, that's kind of the EQI sweet spot, if you will, getting up a high level of EQ, high level of IQ. That's what I think is a strong leader. So a couple of years ago, what I did to validate what I thought was a pretty good model, in fact, this is my mental model. When I meet someone, when I go into organizations, I'm always looking for that combination of IQ and EQ. Where is it? What am I feeling when I meet with people, when I see organizations, when I listen in on teams? How does it come across? But a couple of years ago, what I decided was that if I'm going to be a consultant in leadership, I need to know a little bit more about leadership. So what I did was I started reading autobiographies. I love autobiographies. The story of my experiment with the truth from Mahatma Gandhi. Another book I really enjoyed was I never had it made, autobiography of Jackie Robinson. But one of the ones that always stayed with me was General Norman Schwarzkopf's It Doesn't Take a Hero. Incredible book about his life and times, and sorry for that little problem there. The quote I liked they gave, I would never trust a man who didn't cry. He wouldn't be human. Because there's something about that empathy connection that was was a big part of Schwarzkopf's leadership style. You know, he was someone who was very well respected in many different quarters of the U.S. government. I think probably one of the best generals I've ever seen in my time. I've never had to serve. I have tremendous respect for the military and the profession. But he was someone who, the three most important things to Schwarzkopf were, number one, the clarity of the mission and the goal. Was it clear? Was it attainable? The second one was the preparedness of his troops. Were they going to be successful? And the third concern was for the troops' families. Were the families being taken care of? Because he knew if you were on the battlefield worried about your family, you're not going to be focused on where you needed to be. So for me, he's in the upper right quadrant in terms of being an effective leader. I also went to Google and tried to find out, well, who would be an ineffective leader? Who is a general I would not want to lead into battle? And Douglas Haig's name kept coming up, World War II commander, basically oversaw all the operations during World War I. And this quote was a little bit disturbing. The machine gun is an overrated weapon. So I could picture myself in a trench in World War I, wondering what my generals are doing, and this is his attitude towards what is now becoming a mechanized battle. Douglas Haig's background, unfortunately, was he was a cavalry commander, so he had a certain amount of strategy that he thought was going to be useful on the fields of battlefields of World War I. Again, I probably read too much about this, but of the two commanders, of the two people who I'd want to be led by, it was a Schwarzkopf versus a Haig. So when you think about the different leaders you've had, different business leaders, who would come to mind? Who would you put up in that upper right quadrant? You know, the person I put up there who I actually heard speak a couple of times, Howard Schultz, the CEO, the founder of Starbucks. You know, his book was Pour Your Heart Into It, which is his autobiography, how Starbucks built a company one cup at a time. Because there's something about Howard Schultz's background, the way he was raised, his humble beginnings, I'd probably describe him as a kid growing up in Brooklyn. And what he witnessed was the close devastation of his family as a result of his family's health care. I think it was specifically his father was sick. So he saw what healthcare could do to a family, how it could rip it apart. And that's why Schultz started offering healthcare to his employees. I bet you people on this phone have family members or other people that you know that one of their first jobs that they had, like my daughter out of college, her first job was in Starbucks, because they gave her good training and they took care of her from a healthcare perspective. That to me is leadership. When you read his book, he's obviously a smart guy. He could have done a lot of things with his career, and he came across the concept of Starbucks while visiting Italy. You know, so here's someone who took a simple concept and blew it up into something big, but also took care of people. That's why I like to quote, dream more than others think practical, expect more than others think possible. There's something about that's visionary. There's something about that helps to stretch people to try something that they haven't tried before. And at the end of the day, that's what I think a lot of emotional intelligence is like, to trying to help identify and find your own vision as a way of igniting and help other people to find theirs. So again, the question for the audience is, who would you put up in there in the upper right quadrant? And what I like about emotional intelligence is, I probably haven't said enough, is each time I work with someone in their emotional intelligence scores, I've seen each one of these scores shift. So when a person puts a certain amount of focus into developing an emotional intelligence score, invariably, I'm going to see that the person be successful with that. Now, lower left-hand corner, Bernie Madoff. I would put Bernie down there because, well, Bernie's the kind of person, when you hear Bernie's name, what comes to mind? What are the type of words that are synonymous with Bernie Madoff? You think corruption, you think dishonesty, you think fraud, you think sleaze. That, to me, those aren't the words that I would associate with effective leadership. The quote I want from Bernie, which kind of exemplifies Bernie, is, everyone was greedy, I just went along. So that's not someone who is very self-reflective. That's not someone who really is embracing and owning the fact that he created fraud in excess of over $60 billion. A lot of people were hurt, and even his own family was devastated by what he did. But I got to believe emotional intelligence played into it. There's something about his self-awareness, I'm not sure what that was, but his impulse control had to be low. His empathy had to be low, because he had to make decisions that he knew were eventually going to be devastating to people, but he made them anyway. So again, that impulse control, I would question. Anyone who studied emotional intelligence and is familiar with Dan Goleman's book, think of the marshmallow experiment. Bernie would be the kind of person to grab the marshmallow and not worry about consequences later on. So again, this is where I would find people when I go to organizations. This is what I'm looking for. How can I help people, nudge them up into that upper right quadrant? Because that's where I believe leadership falls. So with this as my mental model, I started working in organizations around emotional intelligence. So the pre-employment, going back to the questions, what would be an approach to identifying emotional intelligence strengths associated with specific job skills? Fortunately, I was able to meet Cheryl DeCruz-Young, who's managing director at Diversified Search in New York City. Excuse me. When you're internal, your focus is internal. Your relationships are internal. And for the 15 years I was at the New York Times, I knew everyone internal, didn't know anyone externally. So I decided to make that transition to go external. I started networking as much as I can, started going to conferences wherever I could. And I met Cheryl at a conference. And Cheryl's area is placing global supply chain managers, this is her area of expertise, into global positions. So this is a high-level people and you know, high-level risk when you bring people into jobs like that. So where we joined was a mutual curiosity about what are the key emotional intelligence strengths of supply chain managers? What are those? If I was going to hire a supply chain manager, yes, I want some experience. I want a lot of experience. I want knowledge. But what about the emotional intelligence side? What is it that makes a good supply chain executive? You could see before each one of those logos, each one of those companies I've worked with, there's a supply chain in there somewhere. You know, maybe at the high global executive level, but there is someone who needs to be able to, you know, to navigate the organization to deliver on time, to keep their commitments. So working with Cheryl, she offered me her network in terms of work. Well, not so offered me work. She was able to connect me with her network. You gradually, over a period of time, she was able to identify executives who were interested in having an executive development session with me at no cost. Now, again, this was kind of young in my my consultant work. I was probably only in operation for about 2 or 3 years. And this was kind of costly because you know, the EQI isn't free. I had to be able to pay for it myself, but I had to be able to get enough information for it to mean something. So over a period of time, we collected it, and as part of that study, eventually we ended up giving. I ended up giving the EQI and debriefing 32 executives around their EQI results. And part of the study, each of the executives had worked for at least 5 years as professionally in the supply chain profession, and also lived in another country for at least 2 years. This was kind of an interesting dynamic to it, because having worked in a different environment, in a different location, it also stretches a person's emotional intelligence. So we're curious as to how that was going to show up. Cheryl connected me with one of her clients in lipochemicals, and this was my first experience at taking all this supply chain emotional intelligence data and doing something with it. Because what it eventually did was it identified what are the strengths, what are the skills that are needed in order to be effective supply chain manager. So each candidate took the EQI, and what I basically did was, as each person completed the EQI, I sent the results to Lipo, and we talked about each one of the executives. We talked about what the hiring manager had picked up from the interview and what the EQI results had said about the response and the scores. Now, in this situation, I retain a copy of the EQI report. What I do is I analyze the results and send them on to the client. So at no time does the client actually hold the EQI report. I'm the person to kind of translate the data, because translating EQI data can be very tricky. It's not simply about someone who gets high scores. It's knowing the connection between those scores and what a person's expected to do and how it connects with their past, because it's all about positioning a person for success. So based on the results, which you'll see in a minute, these are the 5 areas that if I want to hire someone in the area of supply chain, if I want to develop someone to be a supply chain executives, these are some of the skills that I want to be able to focus on. So the first one is that level of assertiveness. To be in the supply chain world, you have to be able to give directions. You have to be able to use your external voice. That's the leadership piece I mentioned before. Self-actualization, the connection to supply chain executives is you have to want it as a goal. In other words, you just don't move into this world of supply chain and be successful because you think it might work for you. In other words, it has to be connected to who you are. Self-actualization is interested. One group that I've worked with that consistently scores high in self-actualization is nursing. I had an opportunity to work with nurses a few years ago. And when I asked them, why they score so high in self-actualization, they often told me that they wanted to be nurses ever since they were young, and they went to nursing school, and they pursued it as a career, and they like what they're doing, and they enjoy doing it to the point where they like teaching other nurses. So when you're really good at self-actualization, it draws you into it, just like supply chain would. People who are good in this profession, they really have a talent for it, and they enjoy it. Not only that, but they're also able to manage the stress and the pressure of the supply chain environment, because things are going to break down. Things are not always going to go well. And as a result of that, you need to be able to manage that. You need to be able to turn whatever happens into a positive, or at least to bounce back in a positive direction. Emotional self-awareness at the executive level, it's always very important, because emotional self-awareness, that tells me whether or not the executive knows if how his or her feelings or emotions are impacting an environment. Are people, are they working better, more effectively as a result of the leader's emotions, or are they being shut down? Are they being pushed back? Is a sense of people recoiling as opposed to moving forward and trying things differently? Also seeing the results that women score slightly higher than men in these 5 areas. Okay, so in other words, if you are a woman in the supply chain, again, within the study, the assertiveness was very important. You actually scored higher than the men, higher in self-actualization. So it's almost as if you wanted it more. They had a higher degree of stress tolerance. They were a little bit more emotionally aware, and their problem-solving skills were high. So it's the type of thing where, again, you have to be able to know how you show up and be able to meet the expectations of the environment. Both men and women scored the same in emotional expression and interpersonal relationships. And women scored higher in most of the remaining emotional intelligence skills. Men scored higher in self-regard. And self-regard, that's that confidence level. That's that ability to be able to take on a situation maybe you haven't seen before, and work through it, be able to wrestle through it, if you will. So here are the results of the 32 global supply chain executives. So again, if I want to, if I'm either in this, if I want to work in the supply chain field and move to the executive level, these are some of the skills that I need to develop. Now again, on the other side of this is the cognitive side. You need to know stuff. You need to know processes. You need to know laws. You need to know procedures. So it's not simply the EQ piece, but it's also the IQ. That's where the resume experience comes in. But if you're hiring someone to be an executive supply chain in the supply chain space, they have to have a high level of confidence comes out in that self-regard. The self-actualization, they enjoy what they're doing. They have that level of emotional self-awareness. That emotional expression, as I mentioned before, it's a little bit lower. And this isn't so much a poker player, but this is a person, or these are people who know, they may know their emotions, but they also know that not everyone wants to know how they feel. In other words, if I feel a certain way in a corporate environment, I know not to express everything. So that's that little gap between the awareness and the expression. And that's a smart corporate political gap, and I think everyone should have that. I've seen the exact opposite, where I have some people with a very high level of expression, like around 120, and they're always talking, they're always like this, and their awareness is low. It's almost as if it's not so much about lowering the expression, it's about raising the awareness. Assertiveness is very high for a supply chain executive, because a lot of time they're in directing mode. They need to tell people what to do. They need to use their authority in the way to get things done. They're not afraid to make decisions, as it comes across in the independence. Interpersonal relationships are strong. Empathy is strong. Social responsibility is strong, but not as strong as independence. So this would tell me, or at least indicate to me, that the people taking the study were mostly in situations where they made independent decisions versus consensus decisions. Also, to be here, you need a high level of problem solving, that reality testing. You need to ask questions and drill down. Impulse control, you need not to act too quickly. You gather information. And flexibility and stress tolerance, it also comes with the job. You have to be able to manage the ups and downs of whatever you're dealing with in that type of an environment. So let's look at the data. So when I saw this data again, I found it very interesting. And I don't often do it, but I decided, let me break it down by gender just to see what we had. So the gender piece, here's the women. And the men. Okay, so you can see from starting from the top, yeah, in terms of the results, men have a little bit more confidence level than the women. Not that that's neither here nor there. Statistically, it's yeah, it's not a bad thing as long as you could deliver. Self-actualization, it would look from this that women in the field have a little bit more of a desire, a little bit more, maybe it represents more goals having been set. Again, there was not any problem finding men. As you can see, I found 20 men in the study. There were 20 men versus 12 women. I don't think I gave that breakdown before. And it was pretty easy finding men in the supply chain field. The challenge, believe it or not, was finding women who reached that level and also were interested in taking this type of an assessment, because it does give some input into a person's background. But again, to be in this field, you have to want it. Emotional self-awareness, this is also very key. Emotional self-awareness, that's knowing how you show up. And I also often say that it's executive knowing how he or she shows up on a Monday morning. And the reason I say Monday morning is that we all have bad weekends. But executives, they're allowed to have bad weekends, but they're not allowed to carry their problems into the work environment. I think we've all seen executives who do that, who come into the morning grouchy, not saying hi to anyone. That's that emotional self-awareness piece. So you can see in this type of environment, that's what's required. You need to be able to, again, know your impact on other people, what it's like to again, we've all been there knowing what people that come in not saying hi, grouchy. The higher in the organization the grouchy are, the worse of a day I'm going to have, because that's just the way we are as humans. That's the way we react to the way people respond to us. Some other things, self-actualization, awareness here. Emotional expression is kind of the same. So what men and women have kind of learned the same thing in certain environments, certain corporate environments. People don't want to know how you feel. People want to know all your feelings. You have to be able to keep them to yourself or know where to express them properly, because expressing them in the wrong quarters, in the wrong situations, it's going to be a problem. Independence, 100. So again, as I said before, you have to be able to make independent decisions as an executive. And the women are able to make that. Men are able to make it as well. What this would indicate to me is that if I'm a woman, I might worry about my decision more than a man. Not that it's a bad thing or a good thing, but yeah, there might be a certain amount of, since that confidence level is a little bit higher, a little bit lower than the independence, it might feel that from time to time. Interpersonal relationships, this is a type of skill that's required across the board, right? To be able to connect with people regardless of the position you're in, but particularly for supply chain, because you're constantly connected to people. Empathy is also high, and it's funny, most studies that I've seen will show women have a higher degree of empathy, but it's not really huge. I mean, right here you see a little bit of a change or a gap there between men and women, but statistically men are pretty good. Women tend to be score a little bit higher, which was kind of jumping down, which is kind of strange here, because men tend to score higher in problem solving. So it's kind of curious that as a problem solver, as a woman, you need to show up a little bit better than a man, but not to the point where you're threatening. Social responsibility, again, women are a little bit more connected from collaboration from a social perspective than men. Impulse control, women have a higher degree based on this, because impulse control is an interesting line. Impulse control often tells me a person's learning style. So in other words, the high degree of impulse control usually tells me a person's a very good learner. As you saw before, I had an opportunity to work with Major League Baseball teams. And I noticed that assistant general managers had this really, really high level of impulse control, because assistant general managers are basically in learning mode. They're learning from general managers how to eventually move up into the organization. So impulse control means I'm here to learn. And if you notice, that's at a little bit higher level, so there's a little bit more active learning, also kind of connected with the goal that I might find with women within the study of supply chain. And flexibility, this would indicate, again, they both have a high degree of flexibility, but women are a little bit more open to change, can use the change a little bit more. Flexibility is about, it's about adapting in a way that as I learn more about the problem, as I learn more about the challenge, I could adjust my solution. People with a low level of flexibility, like 80, 90, or in this area, they don't like change. They stand operating procedures about as far as they'll go. Where flexibility here, this would indicate to me, again, a woman in supply chain, they need to be able to be very flexible. Stress tolerance, yep, they need to have a higher degree. I once asked a room full of women why stress tolerance needed at such a high level, and the response I got was because we work with men. So I would say yes, we have our own way of creating our own stress, and stresses socially, and a woman needs to know how to manage that, how to deal with it, and how to maintain that optimism regardless of what they face. So again, this was the sum total of the data of 32 supply chain executives, and this is what I think is the basis of a lot of research. If I had this tool 20 years ago, I think I would be looking at areas like millennials, specific to different areas. For example, millennials in the biodiversity world, millennials in technology. What makes a successful millennial? And by that I mean, a lot of companies are interested in retaining. Once I bring the talent to the organization, how am I going to retain it? Well, there are probably people in the organization that they don't want to move. They want to stay. Well, what's their profile? What are the types of things that people who are successful in this organization, what do they look like? What are some of the skills that we should be using and attracting towards as far as coming into the company? So again, this is the research piece. I've also done other studies on, I was invited to Clinton Global Initiative a couple of years ago, and had the opportunity to take the EQI through 50 global D&I executives. So that gave me information on, if I want to be a global D&I executive, what are some of the skills that I need to have in order to move in that direction? Or what are some of the skills that I should be developing? So what would be possible uses for emotional intelligence information related to job-specific skills like this? First of all, hiring talent, acquiring talent like this, I think by understanding the emotional intelligence job requirements, then I know that the areas to probe during an interview. Then I know for example, if I know this job needs a high degree of problem solving, if I know this job has a high degree of stress to it, what are some of the questions I could ask to start to probe to find out the person's problem solving abilities, or the ability to manage in a pressurized environment? So it helps to point in a specific direction. There's also certain measures, and that's why you have to be careful, as I said before, in terms of translating the data around the EQI. For example, those scores between self-regard and self-actualization. The difference is, I believe I can do it versus I can do it. So knowing how to read those scores is very important. Independence versus social responsibility, that's another score that you want to be able to translate properly, because that gives you an indication as to whether or not the person can make decisions on their own, or only make them in consensus, which might be required, but again, it has to fit into the context of the job requirements of what you're looking to fill. Then job-specific emotional intelligence helps people target emotional. This is a development thing. How do I target specific areas of development? And that's where the EQI helps to point the executive or the leader in a particular direction. What I often do with clients is that at our very first coaching call, actually before we even talk, I'll ask them to take an EQI. So I know as soon as we talk on the phone, I know what the person's challenges are. I can look at that page 3 that you saw in Jane Doe and almost automatically identify where are those areas and what are some of the concerns that the person should be focused on. So again, this type of emotional intelligence data helps to really target the development. Again, based on the supply chain study you just saw, these are 5 areas that a person would want to develop. So we've looked at the uses of the the EQI in terms of you gathering data, in terms of executive development, in terms of using it for interviews. And also, I may have gone too quickly or babbled through it. Years ago, during my first job, I took the MBTI as one of the first jobs I got out of college, which was working for Phoenix Mutual as an insurance salesman. Lasted about 3 months. But one of the job requirements ahead of time was to take the MBTI. So these are the types of tools that have been used for a long time. But the process is very simple. What I do is I send the potential job candidate the link to the EQI. I get the results back. I analyze the results and send them on to the client for him or her to decide. Does this fit into the context of the job? Or I'll talk to the hiring manager just to hear what he or she picked up during the interview. So just as as you're currently using pre-employment instruments for hiring, the EQI could be used the same way in terms of sending someone access and walking through the results. So in terms of, I just want to leave you with some areas of development. So once you've identified someone needs to increase their assertiveness skills, these are some exercises that I've taken clients through. So the first one in terms of assertive, again, it's developing that external voice. But it's also a piece of emotional self-awareness embedded in here. So would your direct reports, or even if you don't have direct reports, would people describe your leadership style as passive, assertive, or aggressive? Or what would your peers say? Because peers are very important to your development. In fact, if you really want to develop to a higher level, your peers hopefully will be the most honest with you. But it's getting their input, knowing how you're coming across. And a lot of times it's putting your voice in the room. If you feel that you have a low level of assertiveness, a lot of times I'll recommend you have to look and borrow from those people that have no problem communicating. What are they doing? And sometimes it's rehearsing. Assertiveness is one of those skills that can be developed because it's combined with other skills. When you look at at your EQI score, how would you describe your relationship between assertiveness and empathy? Is one higher than the other? One of the first things I look at, and the third thing I guess I look at, is when I give a client their EQI results, after I look at emotional self-awareness and self-actualization, which indicates to me whether or not a person's enjoying their job and likes what they're doing, the next thing I look at is their level of assertiveness, or that balance between assertiveness and empathy. Sometimes I call it the difference between input and output. Assertiveness is your output. What do you say to people? What is that external voice that you're using? Empathy is your ability to listen to people, your ability to be quiet and to absorb what it is they're saying, both the content as well as the emotion. And a lot of times I'll find people out of balance. One's higher than the other. There are people that have a higher level of assertiveness and they don't like listening. And once they see the data in the EQI report, they realize this is a skill that they need to develop. So again, that's why the EQI many times helps to point a person in the right direction pretty quickly, which is why I've had an opportunity to work with several executive initiatives in conferences, because with the right information and a good debrief, a person knows how to self-correct and move their skills in the right direction. Self-actualization. Fantasize for a moment that you had no financial burdens. I mean, really think about that. You had no debt whatsoever. What would you be doing with your life right now? This to me is an eye-opening question. Because a lot of times we get to where we are because we're in jobs because we're financing our homes, taking care of our kids, getting them through tuitions, college, all this stuff. But if you could step back and do something that you really want to do, what would it be? And that I always find that's the core of a person. I meet a lot of executives that are very wealthy and they're in jobs that are very powerful, but they don't necessarily enjoy what they're doing. You'd be surprised how many lawyers I talk to that would rather start a nonprofit, rather travel. I met some lawyers that would rather go back and go to high school and be a high school football coach again, because there's some things that they feel they missed out on life. So in fact, lawyers are interesting. Lawyers become lawyers, at least some of them I've found, because not that they enjoy law, because they're good at it, which is kind of a whole different discussion. Another self-actualization question. If you could put together a 3-year plan to attain a specific goal, what would that goal be? Again, self-actualization is always about challenging yourself. Where are you going to be? What short-term objectives would you set for yourself and how are you going to reach them? And who gives you feedback on your ability and your commitment to achieve these goals? In order, self-actualization, if I go back to everyone who has strong scores there, it's usually about a network. Who's helped them move forward? And what's the kind of reinforcement and support they've gotten along the way? Because these are the types of things that ultimately help, again, push a person forward. Emotional self-awareness, I'm convinced, is the #1 emotional skill that needs to be developed, also known as mindfulness. I don't care what you call it, but that's the ability to know who you are. And I like this quote, the center of your being. What are you all about? It's finding ways of taking time and listening to yourself. There's some really good books out there, to look at. We'll go through them in a second, but emotional self-awareness, it's all about you finding time for yourself. One of the best books out there that I would encourage you to read is The Power of Full Engagement. The Power of Full Engagement by Jim Loehr and Tony Schwartz. Now, and they talk about what are the rituals you have to keep your strength up throughout the day. What do you do in the morning to ensure that you have a good day? This is a self-awareness question. Some people pray. Woody Lewis used to share her Bible reading with me every day over breakfast to set the tone for the day, which is always very positive. Some people take long showers, some people go for walks, some people listen, but to consciously know what you're going to do in order to own the day and have a good day, that's what emotional self-awareness is about. What would be the benefit of starting your day with a new routine? And step back and think about how you kind of start your day and what you want to accomplish by the end of it. It's that ownership piece that's very important. And ownership is a big part of emotional intelligence, from owning decisions to owning your emotions. It's all about you taking time to look inward and to create that time. The name of the book for Search Inside Yourself. Search Inside Yourself is an excellent book for emotional self-awareness. I forget the author's name. You can find it online. Search Inside Yourself was based on Google's emotional self-awareness program. Has some great breathing exercises in it, because ultimately, as you'll see with emotional self-awareness, many of you know this, it is ultimately about breathing and how you center yourself and manage your stress. This I like a lot. I'm most effective at work and get what I need when I fill in the blank there. That's a self-reflection question. What is it that you do? And how do you connect with people? And how do they connect with you? And how do you know you're successful? What's the measurement that's out there? It's all about awareness. Because if you can't answer that question, then you may not know when you're at your most effective. Problem solving. Don't find fault, find a remedy. Problem solving is interesting because problem solving, again, it's under the umbrella of emotional intelligence, because we solve problems, we're always emotional about them, and you need to be able to manage them. And someone with low problem solving, someone who wants to increase their problem solving ability, what I recommend is that they develop a problem solving methodology. And the one that I recommend, it's an easy book, it's a short book. I read it back in IBM. I've actually had a chance to use it once or twice. Is The Six Thinking Hats by Edward de Bono. He describes 6 different ways of thinking. And the book is really good because it describes creative thinking in a process. So it's very easy to explain to people, very easy to play with people, and it can yield some fascinating results. But it also helps you manage the emotional piece. Because when you're brainstorming, creating ideas, what this does is it lets you, again, create a facilitated process where people can contribute and learn how to solve problems. Finally, stress tolerance. It's one of those things where when I do classes, I always like to go around the room and ask people, when you're under stress, right before you get angry, where do you feel that stress in your body? What does it indicate to you that you're just about to blow up? Right? So what is your body's reaction to stress at work? What do you do to manage it? So the first question is, where do you feel it? Where do you feel it in your body? How do you know right before you lose it that I'm getting there? What does your body say to yourself? Because you can't separate your mind and body. But that awareness, again, coming full circle to awareness, is knowing when I'm under stress and knowing how to manage it. And what are your strategies and routines for managing your physical energy? That goes back to the book, The Power of Full Engagement, because it talks about maintaining your physical energy and the routines that you do to kind of sustain that. Now, going back to the very beginning of the program, as I mentioned, this was my first webinar. I apologize for anything that didn't go smoothly overall, but hopefully you have questions. So since this is a new webinar, I decided to do something new as well. So over here on Friday, this Friday, July 14th from 10 to 11, I'm interested in your questions, interested in the dialogue. So I'm also a Zoom user, and I could take up to, I believe, 100 people. So if you're interested in a follow-up and having any discussions, either about anything presented here, or if you have any questions about emotional intelligence in general, just send me an email, and I'll send you the Zoom link. And with the Zoom link, I'd also ask you to send me a question. This way, once we're able to set up the call 10 o'clock on Friday, we'll be able to, dialogue, and I'll be able to answer your questions. You'll be able to hopefully answer me anything as well. Again, I've used Zoom before, never with this many people, so we'll see if it's going to be successful or not. So with that, again, if you have any information, please drop me an email. I'm not on Facebook. I don't Twitter, but I am on LinkedIn. But please feel free to again, send me a link. I'll be happy to connect you with Zoom. If you have any questions in the future, please feel free to reach out to me. So Sylvie, I think I've come to the end of my hour.
Well, thank you very much to you for this very informative webinar today, John, and to MHS as well for sponsoring. Just a few reminders for our attendees. If you'd like to view this webcast again, the archive recording and slides will be available for up to 7 days. All webcast credits will be stored in your account, and you will also get an email within 1 to 2 business days. Your feedback is important to us. Please take a moment to fill out the exit survey that will appear on your screen once full of questions that were submitted. Those will, and he'll be able to reach out to you with the answers to those.